Hey, everybody. I have Jordan Raynor here, and he is a best-selling author of this book, which I read a couple years ago, and I loved it. And I had the opportunity of running into him at a Dave Ramsey event. And anyway, and he just released this other book called Master of One, which we're going to talk about some of the stuff in here right now. But Jordan, thank you for taking some time to chat today.
I'm happy to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'm really excited because I like talking about work and the work that God
if you
created
didn't,
us
I
to
wouldn't
do.
be here. Yeah.
Exactly. And so in this book, you're kind of like going against this jack of all trades thing, because I think that is something that, man, so much like I'm technically a millennial. I don't know if you're like
I am. Yeah.
this past. Okay. Yeah. So our generation, if we'll call it that, I think so many of us just go in so many directions and spread ourselves so thin that we lose all of our effectiveness.
Yeah.
I mean, am I right?
We're good at a lot of different things, but we are not exceptional or world class at anyone. I mean, that's my story. So here's the deal. Let me clarify something too on the front end. I actually don't have a problem being described as a jack of all trades, right? I think it's kind of inevitable, especially for the millennial who tries a bunch of different things until they find what they deem to be their calling vocation, whatever one thing in the vernacular of my book. I think that's fine. So like, I'm a jack of all trades and I'm okay with that. I have a huge problem as a Christian being described as a master of none though, right? If I believe that my work is a primary means in which I reveal God's character of excellence and love my neighbor as myself, and I can't point to anything that I'm masterful at, that's alarming. That's a huge problem. You know, and I just believe wholeheartedly that the opposite of mastery is mediocrity, and mediocrity is a failure of love and a misrepresentation of the Father that I'm called to image bear in the world. So, so in the book, I'm proposing an alternative strategy. So fine, if you're a jack or Jill of all trades, great, but do the work in finding the thing that you could be world-class at and go really, really deep and really, really big on that one thing, primarily in service of neighbor. But also, by the way, I think that's how we find the greatest vocational joy for ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, which I think leads to another interesting point. You touch on this a little bit in the book, but this idea of being led by happiness, chasing your own happiness. And I like this question that you posed. You know, you kind of called it a lie, but this idea that like, what if our happiness in life wasn't the primary focus of our work? What if that wasn't the like sole filter?
What if we're not the center of the universe?
Yeah, exactly. But so many of us are, and you know, and if you look at whatever Pinterest or Instagram, it's like this is what you see nonstop in feeds. Go chase the thing you're really excited about, the thing that makes you happy. Whatever, leave your spouse if they're not making you happy, and all this like just terrible advice. And you know, and it reminds me of Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and then the things will be added unto you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, okay. So how do you talk to someone who is just, you know, under that mindset, who's just believed that, and how do you help them move forward through that?
Yeah, sure. So, listen, I've been guilty of believing these lies. Let me just start by saying
me too.
I think we all have, right? So in the book, I outline what I think are 3 lies of career and calling that virtually everybody has believed, especially millennials. And I think they're particularly dangerous because they keep us from focusing and mastering the work that we've been created to do. So 3 lies are: number 1, you can be anything you want to be, which isn't true. I'm 5'6". I cannot play in the NBA as much as I might like to when I was, 8 years old.
Yeah.
Number 2, I think we bought this lie that we can do everything that we want to do, which isn't true, right? Which I think most of us know that one's not true. And the third, I think, is the most pervasive and one that I attack pretty hard in the book, is this lie that our happiness is the primary purpose of work, right? So I'm a millennial, you're a millennial. I grew up hearing my parents and very well-intentioned adults in my life tell me, I mean, the overriding career advice I got was follow your passions, follow your dreams, do whatever makes you happy. And it turns out this is like awful advice for a couple reasons. First, it doesn't work. Millennials, more than any generation before us, have had more opportunity to, quote, do whatever makes us happy. And yet Gallup and every other poll in the world tells us that we are the least happy generation at work. So clearly the strategy is flawed. And in the book, I actually talk about a bunch of different academic studies that show that the number one predictor as to whether or not somebody will describe their work as a calling as opposed to a job or career is not whether or not they were passionate about the work before they started it. It was the number of years they had spent getting good at the craft, right? So passion is a side effect of mastery. We get to love what we do by getting really good at, which, by the way, shouldn't really come as a surprise to Christians. I mean, you alluded to Matthew 6, right? We are called to model our lives after the one who came not to be served, but to serve. Follow your passions focuses only on what I want, right? On what value a job can give me. And I believe, and I outline in the book, a much more effective, number one, and God-honoring strategy is to follow your gifts. Focus on doing the work that you can do most exceptionally well as a means of making others happy. And that's the most predictable path for finding vocational happiness for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's interesting distinction there, because, the counterpoint that I would make, and that, and I think you just clarified, is that a lot of times our passions are indications of giftings that God has put in us.
100%. Yes.
Yeah. And so
I wholeheartedly agree. So I actually think, and I talk about in the book, I think it's important to ask the passion question, right? I think it's important to do some self-examination, figure out what you're interested in, but not as the end, as a pointer to, as clues to the far more important question of what can I be great at? That's the use of passions. It's clues in a longer game of figuring out what I can be really exceptional at.
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing about, just because I know in my own life following, it's just interesting, because I haven't landed on the most fulfilling work in my life by chasing a thing that made me happy. Like, it was by kind of taking steps of obedience to what God was leading me to through some doors that didn't feel like they were going to get me to where I wanted to be. But coming back to that same Matthew 6 verse, it's interesting that when you are about the Father's business and when you're following what he has for you, it actually leads you to some really fulfilling things. And I found myself doing some of the most fulfilling work I've ever done in my life. And it wasn't just by doing the thing that I was necessarily most thrilled about, earlier on, but God led me there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. And I don't think I don't think we should do work that brings us zero joy or zero happiness, right? The point I make in the book is that passion grows over time. Passion grows in correlation with competency, right? We get to share the master's happiness when we focus on doing good work, right? So I love that parable too, right? I mean, there's so much to extract from the parable of the talents, so many lessons you can glean. But one that I've always found very interesting is, Jesus, we're not told in the parable that the people that he entrusted his wealth to cared about doing that work. It doesn't tell us that they were passionate about the work or that they were excited to do it. Two of them just did it, and they did it well, and the other did not. And when they did their work well, then the master's words were, come and share the master's happiness. They were focused on doing a good job to make the master happy, right? And then we're invited into this joy. I think vocational joy too, right? So it's interesting.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about this, about how to find your calling a little bit and what this looks like. So because I know just from talking to different readers and listeners that there are plenty of people who are in a position like I was years ago, really for many years, where I just didn't know what I was called to do, didn't know what God had me on the earth to do. And I struggled, to try to identify what that thing was. And it was a very unfulfilling, unsatisfying season where it just, angst. And then when you step into that thing, it's like, hallelujah, just amazing. But for me, I had a long time in there. So how do you talk to somebody who's in that situation, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, so I'll answer this practically in a minute, but I kind of want to rant for a second because
please do.
maybe it's because I've just been talking about the book so much that that I'm seeing this. But here's the deal, right? Like, this is a book about calling, but I think a lot of time, I think we're starting in the church to elevate calling to this idol status and really thinking about it in an unbiblical way, right? So here's the deal, right? Like, I think a lot of us think of calling as this idea that there's one thing in the world that God has hidden for me to do. And because I am so special and I have these special gifts, and man, I got to go find that thing because God needs me to do that work. God doesn't need you, Bob. He doesn't need me. If you and I die tomorrow and God wants this work to continue, it's going to continue. He's going to find the right man or the right woman to continue that work. And I think, ironically, that is the most freeing thing in the world. I don't think we necessarily discover or unearth our calling. I think we choose it, right? Like, we have all been given a general call: glorify God, love neighbor as self. And there's so much freedom in that. Now, I still believe that there is work that God has created us to do based on how he's wired us and our interests and our gifts, but there isn't a right or wrong decision, right? You just got to choose something, right? And commit to doing it masterfully well, because that's how you glorify God and love your neighbor as yourself. So in the book, I do offer a practical guide for doing this, for finding, focusing on, mastering the work you're created to do. I would argue, you know, the intersection of this work God's created you is the intersection of the passion question, of the gifting question, right? So what am I passionate about? What am I gifted at? And where do I have the best opportunity to glorify God and serve others? Not where do I have the opportunity or the perfect opportunity. There is no Mr. Right for our careers. There's a Mr. Best, lots of different options, right? And in order to be fulfilled, I think you got to make a choice, but there's not a right or wrong decision, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, I can speak for myself, but I'm sure tons of other people are kind of in that paralysis place, you know, and I feel like there's so many areas of life where people are like this. I mean, waiting for a spouse or waiting, whatever, any number of things where you get stuck waiting for this perfect thing, and it just causes paralysis where you're not actually moving and trying anything, you know? And, and it very much seems like that. And I know in my case, it's like watching how I kind of walk things. I almost felt like it chose me a little bit. I mean, and I do feel like that's common.
Yeah, I think it is, right? I think about Fred Rogers, who I wrote about in Master of One pretty extensively. I think that was his story, right? So Fred Rogers' life started out like a lot of ours, right? He had a ton of different interests, and actually he was good at a lot of different things, right? So he was a very talented composer of music, right? He was also really good with kids, right? And then he had this interest in television, and along the way, as he did a lot of experimentation, which I strongly endorse in the book, a lot of professional exploration, he found the thing that kind of converged all of those varied gifts in a single direction, right? To make the greatest impact. And he went all in, right? And then he mastered this, you know, great piece of television for 40 years. So I think in that sense, television kind of chose for Rogers, but he at some point did have to make an intentional choice to say, okay, this is the thing I'm doubling down on. This is the thing I'm sinking my teeth into. I'm not going to go to seminary. I'm not going to go be a pastor. He actually did go to seminary, but I'm not going to be a pastor. I'm not going to be a minister. I'm going to be a telecommunicator, right? And that was intentional for him.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I'm reminded of, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, but Scott Adams, the guy who was behind Dilbert. Are you familiar with him at all?
Yeah, sure. Not a story, no.
Yeah, I remember hearing him talk a little bit about, and again, I'm pretty sure this is him, talking about just that kind of that convergence of gifts. And so he said, I'm not the funniest guy. I'm not the best, artist. I'm not the best business person, but I have this unique skill set of these three things. And when put together, I'm pretty much one of the best at this combo thing.
At this recipe. Yeah.
Yeah. And it reminds me of what you're talking about with Fred Rogers. And I think that's where the magic is, where that power is when all those things come together and when they converge. And then additionally, beyond that, when in God's timing, they line up with whatever the newest technological shift that we see changing every couple of years, and how it just opens the door for that convergence for things to just really take off.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've seen that in facets of my business over the last decade, where a couple of things would just start coming together, where I'm like uniquely gifted to do these three things, and it makes me a pretty unique combination. And then some really cool things happen as a result, Yeah.
So I mean, I've seen that in my own career, right? So my story is one of pivots to increasingly focus on my path, my one thing. So very practically, I spent the first 10 years of my life as a serial tech entrepreneur, sold my first 2 companies. Most recently, I ran a very well-funded tech startup called Threshold 360 that's doing very well here in Tampa. Ran it for 2.5 years as CEO. And then about almost a year ago, I stepped down as CEO. I spent about a year recruiting my replacement. I'm now chairman of the board, but I did that in part because I felt called to get even more narrowly focused on my one thing. Now, my one thing is actually broad, right? I think my one thing is entrepreneurship, and I was applying that in 2 directions, right? Bringing a tech product to market and bringing content products like the book, like my podcast to market. But I felt called to get even more narrowly focused. But now that I'm running this business, Jordan Raynor and Company, I'm able to see all of these varied things come into play, right? So I've got my skills as a writer and my skills as an entrepreneur kind of converging in this unique opportunity to express those gifts and to do really great work.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about focusing on this one thing and what this looks like. So, because I, like you, I have a lot of things I'm interested in. I very much would have always defined myself as a jack of all trades. And, the number of hobbies that I have just so greatly outweighs my wife, Linda. Like it's just hilarious. And it's the same way with business aspirations. And that's been one of my biggest challenges as a business owner is not getting my hands into too many different things and spreading myself too thin.
Preach. Yes.
Yeah. So my question to you is somebody who seems to be recovering, from this a little bit, like what has worked for you? How have you kind of navigated that? Because there's a million things that we can be doing. There's a million great ideas. And how do you purge and really focus?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I want to talk about focus in 2 different ways. One is in the macro sense of our careers, right? And the second is in kind of in the micro sense of a particular workday. So in the macro sense of our careers, I think in order to know what to say no to, you have to be really clear on what you're saying yes to, right? Which sounds simple, but I don't think that is. I don't think a lot of people have taken the time to really articulate what they are saying yes to vocationally, like what they're really excited about going big on. And then the second piece of that is just to surround yourself with people that you have asked to hold you accountable to that one thing and keep you focused on the work that God created you to do, right? So I'll give a really practical example. When I was running Threshold 360 day to day, I was also writing a book, right? That was more than enough on my plate, especially because I'm called to be an excellent father and an excellent husband. I couldn't do any more than that. And so every quarter or so, every 3 or 4 months, I would come home and my wife and I live in a coffee desert here in Tampa. There's like no good coffee within like a 5-mile radius. And so like without fail, every 3 months I'd come home and be like, babe, I'm going to invest in a coffee shop. I have to do it. There's an open retail space right down the street. We won't be involved at all. Like I know the perfect person to run it. We'll just put up the capital, blah, 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 blah. And she'll like hear me out very graciously and then just look at me. And she doesn't have to say anything because I know I'm an idiot. I know that I can't open up a coffee shop even if as a passive owner when I have these other really big things going on, right? So I don't know. I think I don't know how practical and helpful this is, but I think all of us overestimate what we can be taking on at any one given point in time, right? So I think the default answer has always got to be no to projects and continually saying no to things. By the way, I think Jesus was actually a pretty good model of this. Like it's remarkable how many times in the Gospels Jesus says no to things, good things. Really good things, healing people because he had a bigger yes. He was committing to a bigger yes that he was focused on, right? And I think there's a lot of wisdom, obviously, in the life of Jesus and a lot that we can pull from.
Yeah, one of the things that I was just thinking about this as we were talking about that I have found that's been helpful for me a little bit is the idea of thinking more project focused in terms of start and end date on a project, and like thinking kind of sequentially, because I often feel like if I can't do it now, I'm never going to be able to do it.
Right.
And when I found that freedom to think, all right, I can't do this now. I need to say no to this now, but maybe in 3 years, maybe after I get these other things done, maybe it'll make sense then. Maybe it won't. Maybe I won't even be interested anymore. But but it allows me to unload it on my brain a little bit and to put it on the shelf and to be comfortable that I can reevaluate in a couple of years, you know?
So are you a fan of David Allen's Getting Things Done? Do you
Yep.
know this book? Yeah. So
Yep.
I'm a huge fan of the GTD methodology. And a part of this is this idea of a someday maybe project, right? So
Mhm.
I have tons of projects in my task management system that are on hold and have been in there for years, right?
Yeah.
And I look at them every single Friday to remind myself that, okay, hey, my brain has captured this. I know it's in a safe place that I'll review every week. And I just make it a very quick split-second decision every week as to whether or not I want to activate that project in a given week. And that's really helpful. Just have an inventory of everything I might want to do, right? And for me, kind of one rule of thumb, in my daily workflow, I basically work on one massive project at a time, right? So right now, I am launching this book. It's the only thing I'm doing. Now, I'm doing other things that I have, basic blocking and tackling that I have to do to keep my business running, right? That started as one-time projects and are now recurring requirements, but like the podcast, for example. But other than that, in terms of new things, I do one big thing at a time. So very practically, I am about to hire a chief marketing officer. I know that for sure. Come March, when this book is launched, I'm hiring a CMO. But guess what? I'm not thinking about hiring a CMO. I'm not moving the ball at all on that until January 21st, when Master of One is released in the world, and I can start planning for that.
Yeah.
One big, massive thing at a time. Because as you know, hiring anybody, that's a big ordeal, right? That takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. So
yeah. So, and that makes sense. I'm going back to GTD, getting things done for people who don't know. One of my biggest breakthroughs from that book was just this idea. I did not understand the mental baggage that comes with not having things in a proper place,
dude,
so that you'll come back to them. Like, that changed my life.
It's totally life-changing. It's so simple. So I have a mastermind group we call it the Master Collaboratory for Founders, right? And got 12 people, 12 super talented founders. And I'm like, these guys get it. Like, I'm not going to teach GTD to them. I taught GTD and just the magic of writing down anything that ever comes into your head. And you would think it was the second coming of Christ. They were beside themselves. Like, it's life-changing. So simple. So by the way, if you're listening to this podcast, if you take one thing away from this, write down everything that ever enters your head that is actionable, potentially actionable, right? Anything that you have any level of internal commitment to change, that will change your life, right? And write in a place where you can regularly review it and organize it, whatever. But that's a big deal. It's a big, and by the way, in order to stay focused on your one thing, that's critical, right? Because I have ideas, like, for example, yesterday at church, I had this idea of this trip to Europe I want to organize and actually sell, right? Like, I'm pretty good friends with C.S. Lewis's stepson. He's invited me to like bring people out to his place and out to the kilns where C.S. Lewis lived. I'm like, oh my gosh, that'd be an amazing trip. I need to do that. There's no way I'm doing that within the next 6 months. I've already committed the next 6 months of my life, but I wrote it down and I'm going to review it every week, right? And that's liberating.
Yeah. And adding to that, like, the thing that just changed so much for me was just knowing, like, creating a system that I knew I was going to look at it, because you won't let it go if you don't know that you're going to look at it. And then you mentally carry that baggage and you have all these to-dos and all of this stuff, these great ideas, and you're just carrying that around, and it's just life-changing. So it's another book I recommend that's fantastic.
It's the driest read ever, but it's also the most life-changing.
I think it's probably been more than 10 years since I read it, so I don't remember.
It's so boring, but it's so good. So good.
It was really good. All right. Okay, so I'm trying to think of what else I want to ask you here. I feel like, all right, so what else would you want to say in 2 minutes about this book? Tell us just a little bit more about Master of One, and why you were so fired up to write it.
Yeah, I'm so fired up to write it because I'm fired up about the glory of God. And I believe that glorify is a term we throw around so much in the church. It's it's very hard to pin down a meaning for it. I love Piper's definition of glorify. Glorify is simply to reflect his greatness and reflect his character, right? What's his character? His character is excellence. We cannot say that we are image bearers of Christ and then do mediocre work. And by the way, you can't do a million things at once and not do things with mediocrity, right? So my plea for the church is to care deeply about excellence, because our work is a primary means of ministry in the world. And hopefully this conversation's got you excited about the book. But one other thing I'll say before we wrap up, I believe in going like totally over the top for pre-order campaigns for books. I think most authors' pre-order campaigns suck. You're giving me a downloadable bookmark. Like, that's the lamest thing in the world. So I'm actually giving away a trip for 2 people to go to Europe. You're going to go on a 7-night cruise to Europe, Italy, France, Spain, a Royal Caribbean, not a cheap.
To every person who pre-orders, right?
To be clear, no. My exits haven't been that great. So after the cruise, I'm going to fly to Barcelona and take you to dinner. And then you're going to get to go tour La Sagrada Familia, which is probably my favorite subject that I wrote about in Master of One. It's the world's largest church. It's been under construction for 135 years. Still not done. It's the most magnificent thing I've ever seen in my life. And it was designed by a true master of one, a Christ follower, this architect named Gaudí, who spent the first, 30 years of his career doing a bunch of different projects architecturally around Barcelona. And then he just caught a vision for his one thing, which was going to be this church, said no to everything else, and spent the last 12 years of his life only doing that thing, literally died working on the church, is buried inside the church. It's beautiful. It's just a beautiful story. So giving away that trip if you order the book before January 27th. So step 1, go to Amazon, wherever you buy books, buy the book. Step 2, go to jordanraynor.com, let me know, and you'll be entered a chance to win.
Awesome. All right, brother. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, and it was good to chat.
Yeah, it's great to chat, man.
Yeah. All right. Adios.
Thanks for having me, Bob.